Miss Marple and the Mystery of the One-Eyed Widow. Welcome. Dear friends to Cafe Tales, I'm your host, Ailey, and I cannot tell you how much joy it brings me to know you choose to spend your evenings with these stories. Each tale takes time and love to prepare, but your kindness and the way our little community grows make it all so meaningful. Thank you for being such a wonderful audience. If you haven't yet, do subscribe so you never miss a new mystery. Now let's gently turn the page and begin tonight's story. Chapter 1. The Widow with a Patch the First Week of I. November had brought to St-Mary-Mead the sort of weather that made sensible people draw their curtains early and settle by their fires with a cup of tea and perhaps a good book. The drizzle that had begun at tea time showed no signs of stopping, and the high street gleamed wetly under the pale glow of the street lamps. It was precisely the sort of evening when village gossip flourished, and the residents of St-Mary-Mead had been provided with an excellent subject for speculation in the form of Mrs. Emmeline Sharp, who had taken rooms above the post office just 3 days prior. Miss Jane-Marple, making her way carefully along the wet pavement with her shopping basket, paused to adjust her umbrella, and could not help but notice the warm glow from the windows above Nora Pike's establishment. The new lodger was settling in, it seemed. Mrs. Sharp was what the villagers would call a genteel woman, possessed of that particular composure that spoke of breeding and quiet respectability. She appeared to be in her early 40s, with neat brown hair arranged in a sensible style and clothing that, while not fashionable, was well maintained and proper. What drew the eye immediately, however, was the black silk patch that covered her left eye, secured with a thin cord that disappeared beneath her hair. "Shrapnel, 1941, she had explained matter-of-factly to Nora Pike when taking the rooms, and that simple statement had told the postmistress everything she needed to know about Mrs. Sharp's circumstances. A war widow. Then, one of so many who had been left to make their way in the world with whatever dignity they could muster. Miss Marple had encountered Mrs. Sharp briefly at the post office that very morning, and had been struck by the woman's quiet dignity and the small, careful movements that spoke of someone accustomed to managing with particular care. She had observed with a keen attention that had served her well over the years the tiny velvet case that Mrs. Sharp carried in her handbag, no doubt containing the glass eye that would complete her appearance when required. The case had emitted the faintest scent of balsamic lotion, that reliable disinfectant so necessary for such delicate matters. Mrs. Sharp had handled her postal business with quiet efficiency, counting her coins with precision and speaking to Nora Pike with polite reserve. Now, as Miss Marple continued her progress along the high street, she noticed Mrs. Sharp emerging from the establishment of Mr. Julius Pember, the pledge broker, whose shop occupied a narrow building squeezed between the baker's and the milliner's. Mr. Pember was a man of perhaps 55, with a brisk, calculating manner of one who had spent years appraising the desperate offerings of those in temporary financial difficulty. His shop window displayed an odd assortment of items: pocket watches, pieces of jewelry, ornate picture frames, and various bric-a-brac that told silent stories of genteel poverty and temporary embarrassment. Mrs. Sharp emerged from Pember's shop at precisely 25 minutes past 6, and Miss Marple could not help but notice that the woman appeared rather pale. She walked quickly, her head held high, despite her obvious distress, and when she passed under the street lamp, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of her face, composed, but with the tightness about the mouth that spoke of recent unpleasantness. "Mr. Pember will see no one until 7, Mrs. Sharp murmured to Nora Pike, who had appeared in her doorway with obvious curiosity. "I shall have to return another time." The tone was carefully neutral, but Miss Marple's trained ear detected the slight tremor that suggested strong emotion held firmly in check. As Mrs. Sharp disappeared up the narrow stairs to her lodgings, Miss Marple found herself wondering what business had brought the newcomer to Pember's establishment, Perhaps a brooch to redeem. Some small piece of family jewelry that circumstance had forced her to pledge, and which she now sought to reclaim. The light in Pember's shop continued to burn. The blinds were drawn against the evening gloom. Miss Marple knew that the broker kept regular hours and would indeed see no customers after 6 o'clock, unless the matter was pressing. His housekeeper, Mrs. Blore, would have left by now to do her marketing, returning with the evening's provisions before settling in for the night. Mrs. Blore was a woman of freezing manners and rigid propriety, who had kept house for Pember these past 8 years, with the sort of grim efficiency that brooked no familiarity. She was known to arrive each morning at precisely 8, and to depart each evening at 5, unless an urgent matter detained her. The arrangement suited both parties, Pember requiring competent domestic management without sentiment, and Mrs. Blore preferring a situation that allowed her to maintain her position without the messiness of actual warmth or human feeling. As Miss Marple reached her own gate, she reflected on the small drama she had witnessed. There was something about Mrs. Sharp's manner that suggested more than simple disappointment at being unable to conduct her business. The woman had appeared genuinely distressed, yet her composure had remained intact, the sort of self-control that came from long practice in maintaining dignity under difficult circumstances. The soft-spoken voice of Eustace Clay drifted from Pember's back room as Miss Marple passed. Clay was the local clock-mender, a gentle man with skilled hands and an encyclopedic knowledge of mechanical timepieces. He was often to be found in Pember's establishment, for the broker dealt in all manner of household goods, including the occasional antique clock that required expert attention. Miss Marple had always found Clay to be a pleasant, if somewhat withdrawn, individual. He lived quietly in rooms behind his small workshop and was known for his meticulous work and fair prices. His clientele included most of the village, for in an age when good timepieces were treasured, his skills were much valued. The evening progressed with its usual quiet rhythm, but Miss Marple found herself glancing occasionally toward the high street, where the light in Pember's shop continued to glow behind the drawn blinds. At 20 minutes to 7, she observed Mrs. Blore returning with her marketing basket, walking with her characteristic, quick, efficient stride. It was at 12 minutes to 7 when the shouting began. Chapter 2. The Parlor. Dower on the chain. The shouting that had begun at 12 minutes to 7 came from the direction of Pember's establishment, and Miss Marple, who had been arranging her knitting wool by the sitting-room window, immediately recognized the voice of Mrs. Blore, raised in what could only be described as genuine alarm. Within moments, other voices joined the commotion, the deeper tones of men gathering quickly, the higher pitch of women drawn from their evening occupations by the unusual disturbance. Miss Marple set aside her knitting with deliberate care and reached for her coat. By the time she arrived at Pember's shop, a small crowd had gathered on the wet pavement. Mrs. Blore stood in the doorway, her marketing basket forgotten at her feet, her usually composed features displaying an agitation that was entirely foreign to her character. "The door," she was saying to no one in particular. "The parlor door is fastened on the chain, and I can see the key there on the hall table, plain as day, but he won't answer when I call." Inspector Slack arrived with commendable speed, his heavy footsteps announcing his presence before his bulky figure pushed through the small gathering. He was a man who approached problems with the firm conviction that most mysteries could be solved through the application of common sense and a healthy suspicion of anything that appeared unnecessarily complicated. "Now then, Mrs. Blore," he said, removing his hat and shaking the droplets of rain from it with characteristic efficiency. "Tell me exactly what's happened here." Mrs. Blore drew herself up with an effort at her usual dignity. "I left at 5, as is my custom, to do the marketing for tomorrow's meals. When I returned, it would have been 20 minutes to 7, I found the front door unlocked, which is not Mr. Pember's way in the evening. The parlor door, however, was secured with a chain, and I could see through the gap that the key to the front door was lying on the hall table. She paused, pressing her lips together in a thin line. I called out to Mr. Pember, thinking perhaps he had secured himself in for the evening's accounts, but there was no response. The light burns behind the blinds, but he will not answer. Inspector Slack nodded briskly and stepped into the narrow hallway. Miss Marple, who had positioned herself where she might observe without interfering, noted that the inspector's boots left no marks on the front step. The evening's drizzle had been sufficient to wash away any traces that might have been left by earlier visitors. The parlor door stood slightly ajar, held by the brass chain that allowed perhaps 6 inches of opening. Through this gap, the key to the front door was indeed visible, lying on the small hall table near the letter plate. The rim lock had been thrown, and from within came the steady glow of gaslight. "Mr. Pember," Inspector Slack called through the gap. "Are you quite well, sir?" The silence that followed was profound and somehow ominous. Dr. Haydock arrived as Slack was examining the door mechanism with growing concern. The doctor was a man of practical disposition, who had seen enough of human frailty to approach unusual circumstances with steady nerves and clear thinking. "We shall have to go through the back," Inspector Slack announced, after several more unsuccessful attempts to rouse the occupant of the parlor. "Mrs. Bloor, if you would be so good as to show us the way." The housekeeper led them through the narrow passage that ran alongside the building, her keys rattling against the iron ring she carried. The back door opened readily to her touch, and they found themselves in the small kitchen that served the domestic needs of the establishment. From there they could see into the parlor through the open connecting door, and what they saw brought them to an immediate halt. Julius Pember lay on the floor beside the hearth, his body sprawled in an attitude that spoke unmistakably of sudden violence. His skull showed the terrible evidence of a single devastating blow, and the Turkish rug beneath him was stained with blood that had already begun to darken. "God in heaven," breathed Dr. Haydock, moving forward with the quick, sure steps of a medical man accustomed to emergency. But even as he knelt beside the still form, his expression told the story clearly enough. Inspector Slack surveyed the room with the methodical attention that such scenes demanded. The parlor was a testament to Pember's trade, crowded with the miscellaneous objects that people had been obliged to pledge against temporary need. Silver candlesticks stood beside porcelain figurines. Jewelry lay displayed in velvet-lined cases, and the mantelpiece bore an assortment of ornamental clocks and decorative objects. "No sign of the weapon," Slack observed, his eyes searching the immediate vicinity of the body. "Could have been a fall against the fender, I suppose. Man in a temper, perhaps, stumbling in the poor light." Dr. Haydock looked up from his examination, shaking his head slowly. "This was no fall, Inspector. Single blow delivered with considerable force. Something wide and flat, not the sharp corner of the fender." Miss Marple had remained by the back door, her keen eyes taking in the scene with the sort of attention that had served her well in the past. Now she stepped carefully into the parlor, her gaze drawn to the floor beneath her feet. The doormat, she noted, bore traces of something that glittered faintly in the gaslight, a fine metallic dust that seemed quite distinct from the ordinary dirt one might expect to find in such a location. She knelt carefully, her fingers touching the material with delicate precision. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe you might wish to examine this more closely." Slack turned his attention to the spot Miss Marple indicated. The dust was indeed unusual, fine particles of what appeared to be emery mixed with iron filings, the sort of residue one might find in a workshop where precision work was undertaken. "That's not house dirt," Mrs. Bloor pronounced with authority. "I keep this establishment properly, and that substance was not here when I left at 5. Dennis Pember arrived as they were examining the doormat, summoned by the growing commotion outside. He was a young man of perhaps 28, with the soft features and petulant expression of one who had never been required to exert himself greatly in life. "Uncle Julius," he called from the hallway, his voice carrying a note of anxiety that might have been genuine concern, or merely the worry of one whose expectations depended heavily upon the continued good health of a relative. When informed of his uncle's death, Dennis reacted with a mixture of shock and anger that struck Miss Marple as somewhat theatrical, though grief could manifest itself in many ways. He kept men down. "That's what he did," Dennis declared, his face flushing with indignation. Always demanding his pound of flesh, always finding reasons why a debt couldn't be satisfied on reasonable terms. "There'll be more than one who won't mourn his passing. Mark my words, Inspector." Slack made note of this observation with a sort of attention that such statements invariably received in circumstances of violent death. It was nearly 8 o'clock when Eustace Clay appeared at the back door, his gentle features bearing an expression of wounded dignity that seemed quite genuine. "I heard the commotion," he explained quietly. "Thought perhaps I might be of some assistance. I completed work on Mr. Pember's cuckoo clock just last week, the Black Forest piece on the mantel there. Beautiful mechanism, though it required considerable attention to the escapement." Miss Marple's gaze followed Clay's gesture toward the mantelpiece, where indeed a handsome Black Forest cuckoo clock stood among the other ornamental pieces. As she looked up at it, something about the arrangement of the pine cone weights that powered the mechanism struck her as curious, though she could not immediately identify what had caught her attention. One weight hung noticeably higher than its fellow, and the chain supporting it showed signs of recent handling, a peculiar smoothness in certain links that suggested they had been polished or cleaned more recently than the rest. Chapter 3. Miss Marple Notices Emery. The following morning brought with it the sort of crisp November sunshine that made even the most tragic circumstances seem somehow less oppressive. Miss Marple had spent a restless night considering the peculiar details she had observed in Julius Pember's parlor, and she found herself drawn once again to the scene of the previous evening's discovery. Inspector Slack had cordoned off the shop with the thoroughness that such matters required. But Miss Marple's purpose lay not in disturbing the official investigation, but rather in examining those small details that might, in the clear light of day, reveal their significance more plainly. The doormat, when subjected to careful scrutiny in the morning sunshine, told a story that became increasingly intriguing with each observation. The metallic dust that had caught her attention was not distributed evenly across the surface, as one might expect from ordinary household grit. Instead, it formed a peculiar pattern, concentrated near the edges, where someone might have wiped their feet with particular care, yet absent from the center, where casual traffic would naturally fall. Miss Marple knelt beside the mat with the deliberate movements of one who had long ago learned that patience often revealed what haste obscured. The particles, when examined closely, proved to be exactly what she had suspected. Fine emery powder mixed with iron filings, the unmistakable residue of precision work involving metal and abrasive materials. "The sort one finds on a clockmaker's bench," she murmured to herself, recalling the workshop she'd visited in her younger days, when such skills were more common and highly valued. But it was not merely the presence of the emery dust that commanded her attention. It was the manner in which it had been distributed. Someone had stood upon this mat quite recently, someone whose shoes or boots had carried the distinctive debris of mechanical work. Yet the pattern suggested that this person had made a deliberate effort to clean their footwear, grinding the particles into the fibers, with a sort of careful attention that spoke of conscious intent rather than casual contact. Rising from her examination of the mat, Miss Marple turned her attention to the letter plate set into the front door, the brass fixture, polished to a high shine by Mrs. Bloor's conscientious maintenance, bore two distinct marks that had not been present during her previous observations of Pember's establishment. Hairline scratches, fresh and bright, marred the smooth edge of the opening, the sort of marks that might be made by metal drawn carefully across the surface. More telling still was a small smudge of black substance, oily in appearance, that clung to the lower edge of the letter slot. Miss Marple recognized the substance immediately. Clock oil, the refined lubricant essential to the proper functioning of mechanical timepieces, possessed a distinctive consistency and color that marked it as clearly as a signature. Someone had recently passed metal objects through this opening, objects that bore the telltale traces of horological work. Lady Bantry arrived as Miss Marple was, concluding her examination of the door fittings. Her cheerful countenance was somewhat sobered by the previous evening's tragic events. "My dear Jane," she exclaimed, "whatever are you doing prowling about poor Mr. Pember's doorstep at this hour? Surely the police have matters well in hand." Miss Marple straightened carefully, brushing the dust from her gloves with methodical precision. "I was merely observing, Dolly. Sometimes the morning light reveals what evening shadows obscure." She gestured toward the hall, visible through the gap in the chained door. "Have you noticed the carpet, my dear?" Along the passage from the letter plate toward the hall table, Lady Bantry peered through the opening with a keen interest that mystery invariably aroused in her. Practical nature. At first glance, the hall carpet appeared unremarkable, a serviceable runner in a pattern that would disguise the normal wear of daily traffic. But as her eyes adjusted to the interior light, she began to discern what Miss Marple had observed. A thin line of disturbed nap ran from the area immediately beneath the letter plate to the edge of the hall table, where the front door key had been found. It was barely visible, more a suggestion than a clear mark, but unmistakably present to anyone who knew what to look for. As though something had been dragged across the surface, Lady Bantry observed. But what could have made such a mark? Miss Marple's expression held that particular thoughtfulness that her friends had learned to recognize as the precursor to significant insight. "Things are sometimes moved after we think they are put away. Dolly, keys, for instance, are not always placed where they appear to rest." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Inspector Slack, whose heavy footsteps announced his arrival well before his bulky figure came into view. He carried with him the air of a man who had spent the early morning hours in the pursuit of facts and found them less accommodating than he might have wished. "Miss Marple," he said, with the sort of resigned politeness that had developed between them over the course of their previous encounters, "I suppose you'll be wanting to know what we've discovered about this business." "Only if you think it might be helpful, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, with the gentle deference that invariably preceded her most penetrating observations, "though I confess I have noticed one or two small details that might perhaps be of interest." Slack's expression suggested that he was already regretting his offer of information, but professional courtesy demanded that he hear what the elderly spinster had to say. Miss Marple's reputation for noticing significant trifles had over the years earned her a grudging respect from the local constabulary. "The emery dust on the mat," she began, "suggests that someone with mechanical skills, someone accustomed to working with precision tools, stood here quite recently. The pattern of distribution indicates a deliberate attempt to clean the feet, which seems curious for someone merely calling upon Mr. Pember in the ordinary way of business." She paused, allowing the inspector to absorb this observation before continuing. "The scratches on the letter plate, together with the traces of clock oil, suggest that metal objects have been passed through the opening. Given the position of the key on the hall table, One might wonder whether it reached that location by the most direct route. Inspector Slack frowned as he considered these observations. The official investigation had proceeded along more conventional lines: questioning of potential suspects, examination of motives, search for the weapon that had delivered the fatal blow. The idea that the very mechanism of the locked room might itself provide evidence had not occurred to him. "You're suggesting," he said slowly, "that someone manipulated the key from outside. But how could such a thing be accomplished? The distance from the letter slot to the table must be at least a foot, and the key is no featherweight." Miss Marple's smile held the gentle patience of a schoolmistress addressing a promising but hasty pupil. "Indeed, Inspector, it would require considerable ingenuity. But consider, if one possessed a strong magnet, and if one had first attached some means of guidance to the key itself, might it not be possible to draw it across the floor to its final position?" The implications of this suggestion settled upon Inspector Slack with a weight of unwelcome complexity. If Miss Marple's theory proved correct, then the apparent locked room was nothing of the sort, merely an elaborate deception designed to obscure the true circumstances of Julius Pember's death. "Shall need to examine the key more carefully," he admitted reluctantly, "and perhaps inquire among the local tradesmen about recent purchases of magnets suitable for such work." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "I believe Mr. Clay mentioned recently requiring new equipment for his workshop. The ironmonger would have a record of such transactions, would he not?" As they spoke, the figure of Eustace Clay himself appeared at the corner of the High Street, walking with the measured pace of a man absorbed in morning contemplation. His leather tool bag hung from his shoulder with familiar weight, and his hands bore the telltale stains that marked his profession as clearly as any uniform. Chapter 4. The Glass. Eye on the Mantel. The revelation that awaited them within Pember's parlor proved even more startling than the circumstances of his death. Upon the mantelpiece, arranged with careful precision beside a collection of ornamental timepieces, lay a delicate lace handkerchief bearing, upon its snowy surface, a single glass eye. The prosthetic stared upward, with the peculiar intensity that such objects possessed, perfectly crafted to match human features, yet possessing an unsettling quality that marked it unmistakably as artificial. The iris was a soft brown, flecked with gold, and the craftsmanship spoke of considerable expense and attention to detail. Inspector Slack regarded the discovery with a sort of grim satisfaction that accompanied the emergence of concrete evidence. "Well, now," he said, producing his notebook with characteristic efficiency, "this would appear to belong to our Mrs. Sharp, would it not?" Miss Marple approached the mantelpiece with careful steps, her attention divided between the glass eye itself and the handkerchief upon which it rested. The lace was of good quality, though not new, and bore in one corner the sort of neat initial embroidery that ladies of modest means often employed to mark their personal linens. "Yes," she observed quietly, noting the careful script worked in pale blue thread. "Emmeline Sharp, one would presume." The arrival of Mrs. Sharp herself, summoned by Inspector Slack's constable, provided immediate confirmation of the eye's ownership. She entered the parlor with the composed bearing that had marked her previous appearances, though Miss Marple detected a slight tremor in her hands as she recognized the object upon the mantelpiece. "Yes," Mrs. Sharp said simply, her voice steady despite the obvious embarrassment of the situation. "It is mine. I removed it briefly while I was here yesterday evening. The coal fire was causing some irritation, and I thought it best to allow the socket to rest for a moment." She paused, a single eye focusing on some point beyond the assembled company. "I laid it upon the mantelpiece while I conducted my business with Mr. Pember. The handkerchief is mine as well. I always carry it in case such situations arise." Inspector Slack leaned forward with the sort of attention that significant admissions invariably commanded. And what was the nature of this business? Mrs. Sharp? You mentioned yesterday evening that Mr. Pember would see no one till 7. That suggests there was some disagreement between you. A flush rose in Mrs. Sharp's cheeks, but her composure remained intact. I had come to redeem a brooch, a small piece that belonged to my late mother. Mr. Pember was difficult about the terms. He insisted upon interest that I considered excessive, and when I protested, he became quite unpleasant. The admission hung in the air with the weight of potential motive, and Miss Marple observed the way Inspector Slack's pencil moved across his notebook with increased urgency. You left in tears, then, Slack pressed, his tone carrying the sort of professional sympathy that often encouraged further revelations. Mrs. Sharp's hand moved instinctively toward her eye patch, then fell to her side with visible effort. I was upset. Yes, Mr. Pember said unkind things about my circumstances. He suggested that a woman in my position had little right to sentiment about family jewelry when debts required payment. Miss Marple found herself studying the handkerchief with particular attention. The lace bore no trace of moisture, no suggestion of the fresh tears that such an emotional scene would surely have produced. Moreover, the fabric showed the crisp cleanliness that spoke of recent laundering rather than immediate use. You felt quite giddy, Miss Marple inquired gently. After the argument with Mr. Pember? Mrs. Sharp nodded, her expression growing distant with the recollection. Yes, the confrontation was most distressing. I fear I became rather lightheaded and had to sit for a moment before I felt able to leave. Inspector Slack pounced upon this admission with evident satisfaction. Sentiment, then quarrel, then perhaps more than words were exchanged. A blow struck in anger, perhaps. But Miss Marple's attention had shifted to Mrs. Sharp's handbag, from which protruded the edge of the familiar velvet case. Your glass eye case, she observed with characteristic gentleness, appears quite warm, as though it had been recently occupied. Mrs. Sharp's hand moved automatically to the case, and Miss Marple noted the slight start of surprise that crossed her features. Why, yes, I had only just removed the eye when the difficulty arose. I suppose the case would retain some warmth from being worn. The explanation was reasonable, yet something in its delivery struck Miss Marple as curious. She filed the observation away with the methodical precision that had served her well in previous investigations. The distance from your lodgings to this establishment, she continued conversationally, would be perhaps 2 minutes' walk, and you departed at 25 minutes past 6. If I observed correctly, Mrs. Sharp confirmed these details with growing puzzlement at the direction of the questioning. Miss Marple smiled with a sort of gentle encouragement that often prompted valuable admissions. I happened to notice you preparing tea for Miss Pike shortly after your return, she said. You poured with such steady precision, turning your head just so to compensate for the limited field of vision, a technique that must have required considerable practice to perfect. The observation seemed harmless enough, yet Mrs. Sharp's color deepened as though some significant point had been touched upon. Inspector Slack, meanwhile, appeared to be considering the implications of sentiment transformed into violence, and Miss Marple could see that his thoughts were following predictable channels. The injury to Mr. Pember, Dr. Haydock interjected from his position near the fireplace, was inflicted by something with a broad, flat surface, not the sort of blow one would expect from a momentary loss of temper, rather something delivered with considerable force and deliberation. Miss Marple moved closer to the mantelpiece, her keen eyes taking in the arrangement of objects with careful attention. The glass eye lay precisely centered upon the handkerchief, positioned with the sort of neat arrangement that spoke of conscious placement rather than hurried abandonment. One does wonder, she murmured more to herself than to the assembled company, about the timing of these various elements. the eye removed for comfort, the argument conducted while standing at the mantel, a swift departure in distress. Yet the handkerchief shows no trace of moisture, and the eye case retains its warmth despite the passage of time. Inspector Slack looked up from his notes with growing irritation. "Are you suggesting, Miss Marple, that Mrs. Sharp's account contains inaccuracies?" "I am suggesting nothing more than careful attention to detail, Inspector," Miss Marple replied with characteristic mildness. "The truth has a way of revealing itself through small inconsistencies, and it seems to me that we have perhaps not yet heard the complete story of yesterday evening's events." Mrs. Sharp's composure finally showed signs of strain. "I have told you exactly what occurred," she said, her voice rising slightly. "If you doubt my word, then I suppose you must investigate as you see fit. But I will not stand here and be accused of falsehood, based upon idle speculation about handkerchiefs and temperature." With this declaration, she turned and left the parlor, with the sort of dignified indignation that innocence or well-rehearsed guilt might equally produce, Inspector. Slack watched her departure with the expression of a man who had found his primary suspect behaving in precisely the manner such suspects were expected to behave. Miss Marple, however, remained by the mantelpiece, her attention now focused entirely upon the curious arrangement of the cuckoo clock weights that had caught her notice the previous evening. Chapter 5. 2 weights, 1 high. The Black Forest cuckoo clock that graced Pember's mantelpiece was a specimen of considerable craftsmanship. Its dark wooden case carved with the traditional motifs of leaves and hunting scenes that marked such timepieces as products of the German clockmaking tradition. Miss Marple had always possessed a particular fondness for mechanical objects, finding in their precise workings a reflection of the ordered thinking that she applied to less tangible mysteries. Now, as she stood before the clock in the improved light of mid-morning, the peculiarity that had caught her attention the previous evening became unmistakably clear. The 2 pine cone weights that powered the mechanism hung at distinctly different heights, their brass chains catching the sunlight that filtered through Pember's windows. The weight on the left hung in the position one would expect, approximately 18 inches below the clock case, suspended at the end of its chain in the manner that gravity and regular winding would naturally produce. Its companion, however, occupied a position some 2 lengths higher, creating an asymmetry that no properly maintained timepiece should display. Miss Marple approached the clock with the careful movements of one who understood that evidence once disturbed could rarely be restored to its original state. The chain supporting the elevated weight showed curious characteristics that warranted closer examination, while the upper portion maintained the slightly tarnished appearance of age and regular use. A section near the middle displayed the sort of brightness that spoke of recent polishing or handling. More intriguingly still, these particular links bore traces of what appeared to be a light coating of oil, not the heavy lubricant used in the clock's internal mechanisms, but rather the finer substance that a careful craftsman might apply to ensure smooth operation of moving parts. Dr. Haydock, who had been examining Julius Pember's body with the thoroughness that such circumstances required, looked up from his work with an expression of growing interest. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice carrying the sort of professional curiosity that significant discoveries invariably aroused, "would you be so good as to examine Mr. Pember's jacket? There's a mark upon the shoulder that strikes me as rather curious." Miss Marple moved to where the doctor indicated, her trained eye immediately identifying the pattern he had observed. Across the fabric of Pember's coat, running in a diagonal line from shoulder to chest, was a series of impressions, parallel marks that suggested the pressure of links in a chain, as though something had been wrapped around him. Dr. Haydock continued, his fingers tracing the pattern with professional precision. The marks are consistent with a flexible object being drawn tight, then released. Not the sort of injury one would expect from a simple fall. Inspector Slack approached with a heavy-footed determination that marked his investigative method. You're suggesting the weapon was some sort of chain or rope, but we found no such object in the vicinity. Miss Marple's attention returned to the cuckoo clock, her mind working with the methodical precision that had served her well in previous investigations. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe the weapon may be closer than we think." She gestured toward the elevated pine cone weight. "Consider the mechanics of such a timepiece. The weights are designed to provide power through their gradual descent. But they are also substantial objects, cast iron covered with brass, weighing perhaps 2 pounds each, connected to a chain of reasonable strength. Such an object could deliver a formidable blow." The implications of this observation settled upon the assembled company with varying degrees of comprehension. Dr. Haydock nodded slowly, his medical knowledge allowing him to appreciate the physics involved. "A flexible weapon," he mused, "capable of delivering significant force while conforming to the contours of the target. Yes, that would explain the nature of Mr. Pember's injuries. A single devastating blow from something both heavy and adaptable." Miss Marple moved closer to the pine cone weight, her keen eyes detecting additional details that supported her theory. At the very tip of the cone, barely visible against the dark metal, was a small brown stain that someone had attempted to remove. The substance had the rusty appearance of dried blood, though it had been reduced to little more than a shadow through careful cleaning. "The chain would need to be shortened for effective use," she continued, her voice maintaining the conversational tone that accompanied her most significant deductions. "One would grasp it at a point some distance from the weight, wrapping the excess around the cone itself to provide a secure grip. The polished links we observe would mark where the hand held the chain, while the oil would prevent any squeaking that might alert the victim." Inspector Slack examined the weight with growing excitement, his earlier skepticism giving way to professional appreciation for the ingenious simplicity of the method. But how would the killer restore the chain to its proper position after the attack? Surely the mechanism would be damaged by such treatment. "Not necessarily," Miss Marple replied, drawing upon half-remembered conversations with clockmakers of her acquaintance. "These weights are designed to be adjustable. The chains can be shortened or lengthened as needed to regulate the clock's operation. A person familiar with such mechanisms could easily restore the proper configuration, though perfect concealment would require considerable skill and presence of mind." The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced the arrival of additional visitors to the scene. Eustace Clay appeared in the parlor doorway, his gentle features displaying the sort of professional concern that the discovery of his handiwork in unusual circumstances would naturally produce. "I heard voices," he explained quietly, his eyes moving immediately to the cuckoo clock upon the mantelpiece. "I trust my repair work has not been damaged by these tragic events. The mechanism required considerable adjustment to achieve proper operation." Miss Marple observed Clay's reaction with careful attention. His gaze lingered upon the clock with the sort of proprietary interest that craftsmen displayed toward their completed work. Yet she detected no surprise at the unusual positioning of the weights. Indeed, his expression suggested the satisfaction of one who found his efforts still intact despite the surrounding chaos. "You completed the work recently?" she inquired with characteristic gentleness. "Last week," Clay confirmed, moving closer to examine his handiwork. "The escapement required complete rebuilding, and I took the opportunity to clean and oil the entire mechanism. Mr. Pember was quite pleased with the result. The clock had not operated properly for several years." Dr. Haydock looked up from his renewed examination of the body. "Mr. Clay, your professional opinion would be valuable. Could such a weight, properly handled, inflict the sort of injury we see here?" Clay's expression grew troubled as he considered the implications of the question. I suppose, yes, if wielded with sufficient force and expertise. The weight alone is substantial, and the chain would provide considerable leverage. But surely no one would, he trailed off, his gaze moving between the clock and Pember's still form with growing comprehension. Miss Marple noted the way Clay's hands moved unconsciously toward the weight, then stopped as though he had caught himself in some unconscious betrayal. His fingers, she observed, bore the telltale stains of his profession, the same black residue of clock oil that she had detected upon the letter. Plate, the technique, would require considerable familiarity with such mechanisms, she observed conversationally. One would need to understand how to adjust the chain length quickly and quietly, how to restore the proper configuration afterward, and how to clean away any evidence of the weight's unusual employment. Clay's color deepened as the implications of these requirements became clear. His position as the clock's recent repairer placed him in possession of all the necessary knowledge, while his professional reputation provided him with legitimate access to both the establishment and the weapon itself. Chapter 6. Pawn Tickets. Written twice. The search of Julius Pember's business records, conducted under Inspector Slack's methodical supervision, revealed the sort of meticulous bookkeeping that one might expect from a man whose livelihood depended upon the accurate assessment and tracking of pledged items. Each transaction had been recorded in duplicate, one copy retained in Pember's files, the other provided to the customer as proof of their arrangement. It was among these carefully preserved documents that Miss Marple made her next significant discovery. The pawn ticket bearing Dennis Pember's name showed clear evidence of alteration. The original sum had been overwritten with a figure some 3 times higher, the correction executed with such skill that it might have escaped notice under casual examination. Interesting penmanship, Miss Marple observed, holding the ticket up to the light filtering through Pember's office window. The alteration has been made with considerable care, using ink that matches the original entry almost perfectly. Yet one can detect the slight difference in flow where the pen has traced over existing marks. Inspector Slack examined the ticket with growing interest. You're suggesting that someone changed the amount after the original transaction was recorded. But who would have access to Pember's files, and what purpose would such deception serve? The answer lay partially revealed in Pember's leather-bound daybook, where a curious pattern of entries attracted Miss Marple's attention. Under the date of the previous Tuesday, an entry reading clock verge had been carefully erased and rewritten, the new version appearing in ink of a distinctly different shade than the surrounding text. A verge movement, Miss Marple murmured, her knowledge of horological terminology drawing upon conversations with clockmakers of her acquaintance. Quite valuable in the right timepiece, the sort of component that might command a considerable price from collectors or restorers. The implications of these discoveries were not lost upon Inspector Slack, whose understanding of criminal motivation had been honed through years of investigating the various ways in which financial desperation expressed itself. The altered pawn ticket suggested that Dennis Pember's debt to his uncle had been artificially inflated, while the revised daybook entry hinted at some valuable item that had perhaps changed hands under questionable circumstances. We shall need to speak with young Dennis again, Slack declared, making notes with characteristic efficiency. And I believe a visit to the ironmonger might prove illuminating as well. Miss Marple mentioned something about recent purchases of magnetic equipment. The ironmonger shop occupied a narrow building on the lower end of the high street, its windows displaying the miscellaneous hardware that served the domestic and professional needs of St-Mary-Mead's residents. Mr. Wickham, the proprietor, was a man of impressive memory when it came to the purchasing habits of his customers, and he received Inspector Slack's inquiries with the sort of helpful cooperation that such investigations invariably required. "Mr. Clay?" "Yes, indeed," Wickham confirmed, consulting the ledger in which he recorded all transactions with methodical precision. "Came in last week, he did. Wednesday afternoon, if memory serves. Wanted a horseshoe magnet, the 4-inch size with keeper plate. Said he needed it for picking up dropped parts in his workshop. Miss Marple found this information particularly significant. The 4-inch size. You said that would possess considerable magnetic force, would it not?" Wickham nodded enthusiastically. "Oh yes, miss. Strong enough to lift a fair weight of iron or steel. The keeper plate helps maintain the magnetic charge when not in use. Quality piece of equipment, that one. Not the sort of thing a man purchases lightly." Inspector Slack made careful note of these details, his understanding of the case's mechanics becoming increasingly clear. The possession of such a powerful magnet would indeed enable someone to manipulate a door key from outside a building, provided they had first attached some means of magnetic attraction to the key itself. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Nora Pike, the postmistress, whose precise manner and excellent memory had made her an invaluable source of information during previous investigations. She carried with her a small collection of letters and parcels that had arrived on the morning post, but her purpose appeared to extend beyond mere postal duties. "Inspector," she said with the sort of deliberate formality that marked important communications, "I thought you should know that Mrs. Sharp has been asking questions about train schedules to London. She seemed quite particular about the afternoon departures." This intelligence prompted immediate concern from Inspector Slack, who had encountered fleeing suspects with sufficient frequency to recognize the warning signs. "Did she indicate when she might be planning to travel?" Nora Pike's expression grew thoughtful. She mentioned needing to settle some business matters that couldn't be postponed much longer. "I got the impression that she might be planning to leave quite soon, perhaps even today." Miss Marple found herself considering this development with mixed feelings. While Mrs. Sharp's apparent desire to leave St-Mary-Mead might suggest consciousness of guilt, it could equally indicate nothing more than a natural reluctance to remain in a place where she had become the subject of police scrutiny and village gossip. "There is something else," Nora continued, her voice dropping to the confidential tone that village postmistresses employed when sharing information of particular significance. "Mrs. Sharp has been receiving letters, quite regular correspondence, from a firm of solicitors in London. The return address suggests they specialize in matters relating to military pensions and war widow benefits." This revelation cast Mrs. Sharp's circumstances in a somewhat different light. If she were indeed involved in legal proceedings regarding her late husband's military service, her desire to reach London might have legitimate, professional motivations rather than the criminal ones that Inspector Slack was inclined to suspect. The afternoon brought additional visitors to Pember's establishment, as word of the investigation spread through the village with the inevitable efficiency of small-town communication. Dr. Haydock returned with the preliminary results of his more detailed examination of the body, while various neighbors and acquaintances found reasons to pass by the cordon shop with the sort of casual curiosity that violent death invariably aroused. Among these visitors was Mrs. Blore, the housekeeper whose rigid composure had shown no signs of relaxation despite the shocking circumstances of her employer's death. She carried with her a small collection of household accounts and business correspondence that she thought might prove relevant to the investigation. Mr. Pember was most particular about his records, she explained, arranging the papers with characteristic precision. Every expenditure recorded, every transaction documented. He often said that a man in his line of work couldn't afford to be careless about such matters. Miss Marple examined the household accounts with interest, noting the meticulous nature of Pember's bookkeeping and the care with which every penny had been tracked. The records painted a picture of a man who lived modestly but comfortably, whose business provided a steady, if unspectacular, income, and who maintained his establishment with a sort of careful economy that successful tradesmen often displayed. Yet among these orderly documents lay suggestions of recent tensions. Several entries showed payments to Dennis Pember that had been crossed out and revised, while correspondence with various clients revealed the sort of firm language that suggested disputes over terms and conditions. Your employer had been experiencing difficulties with some of his customers, Miss Marple inquired gently. Mrs. Bloor's expression grew stern. Mr. Pember was a fair man, miss, but he wouldn't be taken advantage of. If people borrowed against their goods, they needed to meet their obligations properly. He'd had words with more than one person who thought sentiment should override business sense. Chapter 7. The Magnet in the Reticule. The Discovery. That Inspector Slack made in Mrs. Sharp's reticule appeared at first examination to provide the conclusive evidence he'd been seeking. The small magnetic device, no larger than a lady's thimble, nestled among the usual contents of a genteel woman's handbag, with the sort of innocent appearance that often marked the most significant clues. "Aha!" Slack declared with considerable satisfaction, holding the tiny magnet up to the afternoon light. "Here we have our means, Miss Marple." Clear as daylight, I'd say. Mrs. Sharp, who'd been summoned once again to Pember's establishment for questioning, regarded the object with a sort of weary resignation that suggested she had expected some such development. Her composure remained intact, though Miss Marple detected a slight tightening around her single visible eye that spoke of controlled exasperation. "I use it to collect spilled pins when doing needlework," Mrs. Sharp explained with patient precision. "My late husband was a tailor's inspector, and he taught me the value of such practical implements. Dressmakers' pins have a tendency to scatter, and searching for them on hands and knees becomes rather undignified at my age." The explanation possessed the ring of domestic truth, yet Inspector Slack's enthusiasm for his discovery remained undimmed. He produced the key to Pember's front door, with a sort of theatrical flourish that marked significant moments in his investigations. "Let us test this theory, shall we?" he announced, bringing the small magnet into contact with the brass key. The result proved distinctly anticlimactic. The tiny magnet, despite its undoubted utility for collecting scattered pins, failed entirely to lift the substantial weight of the door key. Indeed, even when pressed directly against the metal surface, it produced no discernible magnetic attraction whatsoever. Miss Marple observed this demonstration with the sort of gentle interest that she applied to most practical experiments. "Perhaps," she suggested mildly, "we might consider the requirements more carefully. A key of such size and weight would demand considerably more magnetic force than Mrs. Sharp's useful little implement could provide, Inspector." Slack's expression grew somewhat less triumphant, as the implications of this failure settled upon him. The tiny pin magnet, while certainly magnetic in nature, clearly lacked the power necessary to execute the sophisticated manipulation that the locked-room deception would have required. "The ironmonger's records," Miss Marple continued conversationally, "indicated a 4-inch horseshoe magnet with keeper plate, an implement of considerably greater magnetic capacity. Such a device would indeed possess sufficient force to draw a door key across a carpet, provided the operator possessed the skill to control its application." The mention of the ironmonger's records brought a visible change to Eustace Clay's demeanor. He had been standing quietly near the parlor entrance, observing the proceedings with the sort of professional detachment that his previous cooperation had established, but now his gentle features showed signs of distinct uneasiness. "Many tradesmen require magnetic implements," he said carefully, his voice maintaining its characteristic soft-spoken quality. "The recovery of dropped screws and small metal parts is a constant concern in precision work. Miss Marple smiled with a sort of encouragement that often prompted significant admissions. Indeed, Mr. Clay, and I believe Mr. Wickham mentioned that you collected such an implement quite recently. The 4-inch horseshoe variety. I believe. Yes, that is. My old magnet had lost much of its strength. These things happen with age and use. Inspector Slack approached Clay with renewed interest, his professional instincts activated by the obvious discomfort that the questioning was producing. You wouldn't object to our examining this new magnet of yours, would you, Mr. Clay? Purely for comparison purposes, you understand. The request produced a moment of hesitation that did not escape Miss Marple's attention. Clay's gaze moved between his tool bag and the assembled company with the sort of calculation that suggested he was weighing various unpalatable options. Of course, he said finally, his voice barely audible, though I fail to see what relevance my professional equipment might have to these tragic circumstances. The magnet that Clay produced from his bag was indeed a formidable implement, a substantial horseshoe of magnetized steel, equipped with the keeper plate that maintained its magnetic charge when not in use. When Inspector Slack brought it into proximity with Pember's door key, the attraction was immediate and unmistakable. The key leaped toward the magnet with such force that Slack nearly dropped both objects, and the subsequent demonstration of dragging the key across a section of carpet proved entirely convincing. The magnetic device possessed more than sufficient power to accomplish the manipulation that Miss Marple's theory required. Remarkable, Dr. Haydock observed from his position near the mantelpiece. Such a device could indeed draw a key from the letter slot to the hall table, provided the operator possessed sufficient dexterity to control its movement. Clay's expression grew increasingly troubled as the implications of his magnet's capabilities became clear. Surely you don't suspect that the possession of such a tool doesn't constitute evidence of criminal intent. Half the craftsmen in the county probably own similar implements. Miss Marple approached Clay with the sort of gentle directness that had served her well in previous investigations. Mr. Clay, she said quietly, I noticed that your hands bear the distinctive stains of your profession. Clock oil, I believe, leaves a particularly characteristic mark upon the fingers. Clay glanced down at his hands with obvious reluctance, and Miss Marple observed the way his thumbs showed the telltale black sheen that prolonged contact with refined lubricants invariably produced. The staining was consistent with recent and extensive work involving the sort of precision mechanisms that required careful oiling. You have been working with timepieces quite recently, she continued conversationally, and I believe we observed traces of similar oil upon Pember's letter plate, the sort that might be transferred from tools or implements passed through that opening. The coincidence of these observations was building into a pattern that even Clay's gentle nature could not entirely obscure. His possession of the powerful magnet, combined with his access to Pember's establishment and his obvious familiarity with mechanical devices, placed him in a unique position to have executed the locked room deception. There is also the matter of the emery dust, Miss Marple added with characteristic thoroughness. The particles found upon Pember's doormat were precisely the sort that one might find in a clockmaker's workshop, the residue of precision work involving metal components and abrasive materials. Clay's composure finally began to show signs of strain. His tool bag, Miss Marple noted, would indeed carry the implements necessary for such work, and the leather surface showed the sort of wear that suggested regular contact with abrasive materials. I think, Mr. Clay, Inspector Slack said with growing authority, that we shall need to examine your workshop rather thoroughly, and perhaps you would be good enough to account for your whereabouts yesterday evening in rather more detail than you have previously provided. Chapter 8. The Scratch. On the letter plate. The methodical examination of Pember's letter plate under Miss Marple's patient guidance, revealed details that transformed what had initially appeared to be minor surface damage into compelling evidence of deliberate manipulation, armed with a magnifying glass, borrowed from Dr. Haydock's medical bag. She traced the hairline scratches with the sort of careful attention that such delicate work demanded. "The marks follow a consistent pattern," she observed, her voice maintaining the conversational tone that accompanied her most significant discoveries. Not the random scoring that ordinary use would produce, but rather the systematic scratching that would result from repeated contact with a specific implement. Inspector Slack leaned forward to examine the scratches more closely, his earlier skepticism gradually giving way to professional appreciation for the elderly spinster's powers of observation. The marks were indeed distinctive, two parallel lines that extended across the brass surface in a manner that suggested careful, deliberate action rather than casual damage. "Something has been drawn across this surface multiple times," Miss Marple continued, adjusting the magnifying glass to capture the scratches in optimal light. "The depth and consistency of the scoring suggest a metal object of considerable hardness, perhaps a key or similar implement that has been manipulated with some force. The implications of this observation became clearer when combined with her earlier measurements of the distances involved in the locked room deception. The letter plate stood approximately 12 inches from the hall table where Pember's key had been discovered, a span that would require considerable precision to traverse successfully. Dr. Haydock, whose medical training had instilled in him an appreciation for careful measurement and documentation, produced a steel ruler from his bag and confirmed Miss Marple's calculations. 12 inches exactly, he announced. And if one considers the angle required to maneuver a key through the letter slot and across to the table. His voice trailed off as he contemplated the mechanical challenges that such an operation would present. The successful execution of the deception would require not only the powerful magnet that Clay had demonstrated, but also considerable skill in controlling its application through the narrow opening of the letter plate. Miss Marple's attention had shifted to the corner of the hall table, where her keen eyes detected additional evidence that supported her growing theory. The polished wooden surface showed a fresh gouge, a small but unmistakable mark where something hard had struck the edge with sufficient force to disturb the finish. The key would arrive at considerable speed, she mused, running her finger along the damaged area. Drawn by magnetic force across 12 inches of carpet, it would strike the table edge with enough momentum to leave precisely this sort of mark. Beneath the hall mat, careful searching revealed two additional pieces of evidence that completed the picture of methodical preparation. Small crumbs of sealing wax, red in color and bearing the impressions of recent handling, lay among the ordinary dust and debris that accumulated in such locations. "Sealing wax," Miss Marple announced with satisfaction, holding the fragments up for inspection. "The sort used to secure letters and packages, but also useful for creating temporary attachments when more permanent methods would prove unsuitable." Inspector Slack examined the wax crumbs with growing understanding of their significance. "You're suggesting that someone used these to attach something to the key. But what purpose would such an attachment serve?" The answer lay in the final piece of evidence that Miss Marple's patient searching uncovered. Caught in the rough texture of the sealing wax was a single thread of silk, so fine as to be nearly invisible, yet bearing at one end the unmistakable signs of having been burned. "A guide thread," she explained, holding the delicate filament up to the light. Attached to the key with sealing wax, it would allow the operator to maintain some control over the key's movement as it was drawn across the floor. Once the manipulation was complete, a touch with a lighted match would destroy the evidence, leaving only these small traces to mark what had occurred. The elegance of this solution impressed even Inspector Slack, whose appreciation for criminal ingenuity was tempered by years of dealing with less sophisticated malefactors. The use of silk thread and sealing wax spoke of considerable forethought and planning, qualities that elevated the crime from simple violence to calculated deception. Eustace Clay, who had been observing these discoveries with obvious discomfort, now appeared to be struggling with some internal conflict. His gentle features bore the sort of expression that suggested a man weighing the relative merits of continued silence against the relief that confession might provide. The technique would require considerable practice, Miss Marple observed, her tone remaining conversational despite the gravity of her implications. One could hardly expect to execute such a delicate manipulation successfully on the first attempt. I imagine the perpetrator would have needed to experiment with the method in advance. This observation produced a visible reaction from Clay, whose hands moved unconsciously toward his tool bag, before stopping with obvious effort. Miss Marple noted the gesture with interest, filing it away with the other small behavioral details that often proved more revealing than direct testimony. Dr. Haydock, meanwhile, had been considering the timing that such an elaborate deception would require. How long would the entire process take? He wondered aloud. The manipulation of the key, the burning of the thread, the restoration of the crime scene to its apparent locked state. Miss Marple's calculations suggested a matter of minutes rather than hours, sufficient time for someone familiar with the technique to complete the work, but not so lengthy as to create unnecessary exposure to discovery. The killer had demonstrated both skill and efficiency in executing the deception. There is also the question of access, she continued, her methodical approach leaving no aspect of the crime unexplored. The perpetrator would need to know Mr. Pember's habits sufficiently well to predict his movements and timing. This suggests someone with regular contact with the establishment. Inspector Slack's notebook had filled with details as the investigation progressed, and he now reviewed his entries with the sort of systematic attention that complex cases demanded. The various elements were beginning to form a coherent pattern: means, opportunity, and method, all pointing toward a single conclusion. "Mr. Clay," he said formally, "I believe the time has come for a more detailed discussion of your activities yesterday evening. Your earlier account mentioned completing work at Much Benham, but I think we need to examine that alibi rather more carefully." Clay's composure finally showed signs of complete collapse. His shoulders sagged with the weight of accumulated evidence, and his voice, when he spoke, barely rose above a whisper. "The verge movement," he said suddenly, his words seeming to emerge without conscious volition. "It was worth more than he admitted, considerably more. I had a buyer in London who would have paid 3 times what Pember offered." The admission hung in the air like a confession, though Clay seemed unaware that he had revealed anything significant. Inspector Slack leaned forward with renewed attention, sensing that the crucial moment of the investigation was approaching. Chapter 9. Clockman's Bill and Alibis. Clay's inadvertent reference to the verge movement opened a line of inquiry that Inspector Slack pursued with the methodical thoroughness that such admissions invariably required. The clockmaker's obvious distress at having revealed more than he intended suggested that this particular transaction lay at the heart of the evening's tragic events. This verge movement, Slack began, consulting his notes with characteristic precision. Was this the item listed in Mr. Pember's daybook under Tuesday's entries, the one that appears to have been erased and rewritten? Clay's face had taken on the pallor of a man who found himself trapped by his own words. His gentle features showed the sort of anguish that accompanied the collapse of carefully maintained deceptions, and his hands trembled slightly as he attempted to maintain his composure. Mr. Pember was not entirely forthright about the value of certain items, Clay said carefully, his voice barely audible. The verge movement in question was a particularly fine example. 17th century. with the original maker's marks intact. Such pieces are exceedingly rare in today's market. Miss Marple listened to this explanation with a sort of patient attention that she applied to all significant revelations. The mention of the movement's age and provenance suggested a value considerably beyond what ordinary pledge transactions would typically involve. You had arranged a sale to a collector in London, she inquired gently, her tone encouraging further disclosure without appearing to press for information. Clay nodded miserably. A gentleman who specializes in early English clockwork. He had offered $200 for the right piece, and the verge movement would have suited his requirements perfectly. But Mr. Pember insisted on treating it as ordinary pledge goods, $50 at most, he claimed. The sum involved cast the dispute in an entirely different light. $200 represented a substantial amount, more than many working men might earn in a year, and certainly sufficient to justify passionate disagreement between business associates. Inspector Slack made careful notes of these financial details while considering their implications for the case. And your arrangement with Mr. Pember regarding the sale? Were you to receive a commission for facilitating the transaction? Half the proceeds, Clay confirmed reluctantly. We had agreed that I would handle the technical assessment and authentication, while he would manage the business arrangements with the client. But when the time came to complete the sale, he insisted on renegotiating our agreement. Dr. Haydock, who had been listening to this exchange with professional interest, now interjected with a question that went to the heart of the matter. You visited Much Benham yesterday evening, you said. What time did you return to St-Mary-Mead? The question produced another visible wave of distress in Clay, whose earlier account of his movements had clearly been incomplete. His gaze moved between the assembled investigators with the sort of calculation that suggested he was weighing various unpalatable truths against each other. I returned earlier than I initially indicated, he admitted finally. The work at Much Benham took less time than anticipated, and I was back in the village by 6. This revision of his timeline placed Clay in St-Mary-Mead during the crucial period when Pember's murder had occurred. Inspector Slack noted the discrepancy with obvious satisfaction, recognizing the significance of alibis that crumbled under careful examination. The publican at Much Benham, Slack said, consulting his earlier notes, vouched for your presence until 6:20. That would allow sufficient time to return here by 6, would it not? Clay's acknowledgement of this possibility came with obvious reluctance. The collapse of his carefully constructed alibi left him exposed to suspicion during the period when the crime had been committed, and his earlier deception suggested consciousness of guilt that was difficult to explain away. Miss Marple had been considering the various elements of the case with her characteristic thoroughness, and she now addressed a question that had been troubling her since the discovery of the locked room deception. Mr. Clay, she said quietly, the technique required to manipulate the key through the letter plate would demand considerable practice. One could hardly expect to execute such a delicate operation successfully without prior experimentation. Where might someone conduct such rehearsals without attracting attention? The question struck Clay with obvious force, and his response revealed more than he perhaps intended. One's own workshop, he said automatically, then stopped with evident horror at his admission. Inspector Slack leaned forward with renewed interest. You have practiced this technique in your own establishment. For what possible legitimate purpose? The trap that Clay had inadvertently created for himself was now complete. His admission that he possessed both the knowledge and the practical experience necessary to execute the locked room deception, combined with his revised timeline and the financial motive revealed by the Verge movement dispute, created a compelling case for his guilt. It was not that. I never intended, Clay began, then fell silent as the weight of his accumulated admissions settled upon him. Miss Marple observed his distress with a sort of compassionate understanding that she extended to all human frailty, regardless of its criminal manifestations. The quarrel with Mr. Pember was about more than money, was it not? She said gently. There was also the matter of professional respect, the recognition of your expertise and the value of your contributions to these transactions. Clay's response came in a voice thick with emotion. 20 years I've worked with timepieces, miss. 20 years of learning and skill, and he treated me like a common laborer who could be dismissed when convenient. The Verge movement was my discovery, my authentication, but he wanted to claim the entire profit while offering a mere pittance for my efforts. The human dimension of the crime was becoming clearer. What had begun as a business dispute had escalated into something more personal, a conflict between two men with fundamentally different views of their professional relationship and the proper distribution of its rewards. Dennis Pember's whereabouts during the crucial period had been thoroughly documented through his presence at the village pub, where numerous witnesses had observed him drinking steadily from 10 minutes past 6 until well past 7 o'clock. His alibi, unlike Clay's, remained intact despite careful scrutiny. Mrs. Bloor's movements had been equally well established through her marketing expedition and the precise timing of her domestic routines. Her discovery of the locked parlor and her immediate summoning of assistance left no opportunity for her involvement in the crime itself. The process of elimination was pointing inexorably toward Eustace Clay as the only person with the means, opportunity, and motive necessary to commit the murder. His possession of the required tools, his admitted practice with a key manipulation technique, and his presence in the village during the crucial period, combined with his powerful motive, created a compelling case. Mr. Clay, Inspector Slack said formally, I believe the time has come for us to visit your workshop. There may be additional evidence there that will help us understand exactly what occurred yesterday evening. Chapter 10. Parlor, Weight, Magnet, and a Widow's Field of View. The final gathering in Pember's parlor brought together all the principal figures in the case, assembled under Miss Marple's gentle but authoritative direction to witness her complete reconstruction of the previous evening's events. The afternoon light streaming through the windows illuminated the scene with the sort of clarity that seemed appropriate for the revelation of long-concealed truths. Miss Marple positioned herself near the mantelpiece, with the deliberate care that marked all her significant demonstrations. Her knitting bag rested at her feet, but her attention was focused entirely upon the various elements of evidence that told the story of Julius Pember's death. The means by which Mr. Pember met his end, she began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from complete understanding of the facts, involved considerable ingenuity and mechanical skill. The weapon was neither exotic nor hidden. Indeed, it remained in plain sight throughout our investigation. She gestured toward the Black Forest cuckoo clock with its distinctive pine-cone weights. These weights, designed to power the clock's mechanism through their gradual descent, also possessed the mass and leverage necessary to deliver a devastating blow. Connected to their chains, they become flexible weapons capable of conforming to the contours of their target. Dr. Haydock nodded in professional agreement. The injury pattern we observed was entirely consistent with such an implement, a broad, flat impact that delivered tremendous force while avoiding the sharp edges that would mark more conventional weapons. Miss Marple approached the clock with careful steps, her movements illustrating the reconstruction she had developed through patient observation. The killer lifted a length of chain, wrapping it once around the pine-cone tip to secure his grip. The polished links we observed marked where his hand held the chain, while the brown stain at the cone's tip bore witness to its terrible employment. Inspector Slack watched this demonstration with the sort of attention that complete solutions invariably commanded. The elegance of the method impressed him despite its horrific purpose. A weapon that appeared innocent, required no preparation, and could be restored to its normal configuration within moments of the crime. The high position of one weight, Miss Marple continued, resulted from the killer's need to shorten the chain for effective use. After delivering the fatal blow, he restored the mechanism to its proper configuration. But the hasty nature of this adjustment left the weight hanging 2 links higher than its companion. She paused, allowing the assembled company to absorb these mechanical details before moving to the more complex aspect of the deception. The apparent locked room presented a greater challenge, but one that yielded to the same combination of skill and preparation that marked the attack itself. Moving to the parlor door, she indicated the chain that had secured it from within. This chain was set earlier in the evening during the killer's legitimate visit to the establishment. A simple matter of engaging the fastening while appearing to examine the door's operation, something that would attract no attention from Mr. Pember. Inspector Slack frowned as he considered the implications of this. Timing. But how could the killer escape through a chained door? The opening would be too narrow for a man to pass through. Miss Marple's smile held the satisfaction of a teacher, whose pupils were beginning to grasp a complex lesson. He did not escape through the chained door, Inspector. He departed through the back entrance, locking the front door with his own key as he left. The deception lay not in the departure, but in the subsequent return of Mr. Pember's key to its apparent resting place. She produced from her handbag the fragments of sealing wax and burned silk thread that her searching had uncovered. The key was prepared with these simple materials: strand of fine silk attached with sealing wax to provide guidance and control. The powerful magnet that Mr. Clay had purchased was then employed to draw the key through the letter slot and across the floor to the hall table. The mechanical precision required for such an operation impressed even those who'd heard her theory before. The distance involved, the angle of approach, the need to control the key's movement with sufficient accuracy to reach its intended destination, all spoke of considerable practice and skill. The scratches on the letter plate, she continued, marked the passage of the key as it was drawn through the opening. The drag line in the carpet showed its path across the floor, while the gouge on the table edge recorded its arrival at the final destination. A touch with a lighted match destroyed the silk guidance thread, leaving only these small traces to tell the story. Eustace Clay, who had listened to this reconstruction with growing anguish, finally found his voice. "The technique required weeks of practice," he said hollowly. "I never intended. It was only an intellectual exercise at first, a problem to be solved. I never thought I would actually—" His confession trailed off into silence. But Miss Marple continued her methodical elimination of the other suspects with the thoroughness that complete demonstrations required. Mrs. Sharp's small pin magnet, she explained, lacked entirely the power necessary for such manipulation. Moreover, her behavior throughout the crisis betrayed the honesty of her account. Her glass eye case remained warm from recent removal, evidence that she had indeed taken it out during her visit to Mr. Pember. Had she staged the parlor scene, she would never have left such clear testimony to her presence. She turned her attention to the widow's distinctive mannerisms. Her adaptation to single-eye vision revealed itself in small ways. The careful turn of her head when pouring tea, the precise movements that compensated for her limited field of view. These habits, developed through necessity, marked her as someone who could not have executed the complex deceptions required for this crime. Dennis Pember's alibi had withstood all scrutiny, his presence at the village pub documented by numerous witnesses throughout the crucial period, Mrs. Bloor's rigid adherence to her domestic schedule, and her immediate discovery of the locked parlor eliminated her from consideration with equal certainty. The emery dust on the doormat, Miss Marple concluded, came from Mr. Clay's workshop, transferred on his shoes despite his careful attempts at concealment. The clock oil on the letter plate matched the stains upon his hands, while his possession of the powerful magnet provided the final element necessary for the deception. Clay's final collapse came with the weight of accumulated evidence and his own admissions. He meant to cheat me of the verge movement, he said brokenly. 20 years of skill and knowledge dismissed as though I were a common laborer. I only meant to reason with him. But when he laughed, when he said I should be grateful for whatever scraps he chose to offer, Inspector Slack stepped forward with the grim satisfaction of a case. Concluded. Eustace Clay, he announced formally, I arrest you for the murder of Julius Pember. As Clay was led away, his shoulders bowed with shame and defeat, Miss Marple found herself standing beside Mrs. Sharp on the pavement outside Pember's establishment. Lady Bantry approached them both, her expression thoughtful as she regarded the widow's steady patch. Poor thing, Dolly murmured. How cruel to make her the mystery! Miss Marple folded her knitting with the careful precision that marked all her actions. One eye or two, my dear. Truth is much the same. It is the things that won't lie. Emery on a mat, a weight set a link too high, and a key that remembers how it was dragged. The November afternoon was drawing toward evening, and the lights of St-Mary-Mead were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Another mystery had been solved, another truth revealed through patient observation and gentle persistence. Miss Marple gathered her belongings and made her way home, leaving behind a village that would have much to discuss over many cups of tea in the days to come.